Hercule Poirot and the Clock That Missed a Minute. Chapter 1. The Clock That Struck Late. It began, as curious things often did in the life of Hercule Poirot, with something utterly trivial. The village of Harrowby Green was the sort of place where the most pressing concern on any given day might be a missing parcel of scones, or a cow wandering into the cricket ground. Nestled in the Surrey countryside, it boasted an ancient post office, a Victorian church with a tower that leaned ever so slightly, and a tight circle of polite suspicion shared by its long-term residents. Poirot found himself there not by coincidence, but at the behest of an old acquaintance, Lady Margaret Windermere. She had written a most imploring letter from Greystoke Lodge, her family estate just beyond the village. The tone was urgent if vague, and she had used a phrase Poirot could never ignore. "There is something deeply wrong, Monsieur Poirot, and I fear it will not remain hidden for long." Captain Hastings, arriving a day later from London to join Poirot, found his old friend seated in a stiff-backed chair near the window of the guest lounge at the Harrowby Green Hotel, gazing contemplatively at a battered carriage clock on the mantel. "A curious place to bring you out of semi-retirement, eh, Poirot?" Hastings said cheerily, unbuttoning his coat and settling in beside him. Poirot nodded, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "My dear Hastings, do you observe the time on that clock?" Hastings squinted. 3:10. "Just so. But it struck 3 only a moment ago. One chime, not 2 or 3, but 1. I timed it. The mechanism is delayed by precisely 1 minute and 13 seconds. It is a most deliberate misalignment." Hastings chuckled. "Surely you don't think that's significant?" Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "In itself, perhaps not, but in the context of Lady Windermere's letter, and what I have seen at Greystoke Lodge, yes, I think it may be très significatif." They arrived at the estate that afternoon. Greystoke Lodge stood in somber elegance at the edge of a wooded ravine, ivy-clad and solid, with stone lions flanking the entryway. Lady Margaret received them in her morning room, the fire gently crackling, a tea-tray untouched at her side. She was a dignified woman in her late 60s, upright and commanding, her pale blue eyes both kind and anxious. "It's my nephew Philip," she began, once pleasantries had been exchanged. "Or rather, it was. He died last week, alone, in the study. The coroner said it was a heart attack." "I am sorry," Poirot said softly. He was a man of what age? 39. A healthy young man, at least in appearance. No history of heart troubles. "And yet, a natural death has been declared," Poirot said, watching her closely. Lady Margaret hesitated. "Yes. But that's not why I wrote to you. It is something else. The night he died, just before supper, he came to me in quite a state, rambling, almost breathless. He said something very strange. He said, 'A minute can be stolen, a single minute, and someone has stolen mine.'" Poirot blinked slowly. "Une minute volée. Curious." She nodded. "And now, days after his death, I find strange things. A burnt photograph in the fireplace. My husband's old pocket watch, missing and then returned, with its minute hand loosened. And yesterday, I discovered someone had tampered with the library clock. I had it checked. It strikes the hour, but lags by just over a minute." Poirot's eyes brightened, but his tone remained calm. And you are certain these were not his eccentricities? He was not prone to flights of imagination, she said, but Philip was troubled. He had secrets, Monsieur Poirot. Secrets I fear may have been worth killing for. The phrase settled into the silence like a falling veil. Poirot rose. Lady Windermere, I must ask to see the study where he died. She led them through a shadowed corridor to a richly paneled room filled with heavy books and the scent of pipe smoke. The chair where Philip had collapsed remained undisturbed. The decanter was half empty. A copy of the Times lay folded neatly on the desk. Poirot walked slowly, his gaze flitting over the surfaces, not for dust or fingerprints, but for what was missing. He paused at the mantel clock. He opened its face gently. You see, Hastings? Again, 1 minute and 13 seconds behind. Poirot turned to Lady Windermere. Madam, forgive me, but did your nephew have enemies? She looked toward the window, then answered, Only one that I know of, his cousin Andrew. They quarreled over the estate. And there was the matter of the old inheritance document. It disappeared years ago, but Philip always believed someone in the family had hidden it. He said it was the key to everything. Poirot's fingers danced thoughtfully over his lapels. And where is Monsieur Andrew now? Lady Windermere's face tightened. Here. He arrived yesterday for the funeral. Poirot smiled. Then, Hastings, we shall stay, for there is something wrong here, something quite out of order, and I intend to find the missing minute. Chapter 2. The Man Who Inherited Nothing. Andrew. Windermere was not the man Hercule Poirot had expected to meet. Tall, bronzed, and exuding an almost theatrical nonchalance, he greeted them in the sunlit drawing-room with a glass of sherry in one hand and a raised eyebrow. So you're the detective, eh? Come to sniff around old clocks and family ghosts. Poirot bowed his head courteously. Monsieur Windermere, and you are the cousin of the late Philip. First cousin, though you wouldn't know it from the hair, Will. He gave a quick, bitter laugh. Philip got the house, the money, the land. I got an envelope containing a letter of apology from my late uncle, and a pair of antique cufflinks that he never wore. Poirot observed him silently, noting the faint stain of red wine on his cuff, the forced joviality in his voice, and the flicker of something deeper in his eyes. And what brought you back to Greystoke Lodge now, if you do not mind me asking? Andrew sipped his drink. Guilt, nostalgia, theatrical curiosity? I came for the funeral, of course. Lady Margaret insisted. She always did like to keep up appearances. Had you and your cousin spoken recently? Not in years, Andrew replied. We fell out over a family trust some years back. Philip always fancied himself a sleuth, poking through old ledgers and rattling about in the attics. Said there was a mistake in the inheritance. Something to do with a lost codicil or some such nonsense. Grandfather Windermere's documents were a rat's nest. Yet you did not take his theories seriously. Oh, I'm sure he found a dozen ghosts in the wallpaper, Andrew said, now turning toward the window. Philip had a mind for puzzles, but he lacked the will to do anything useful with it. Always digging, never building. Hastings, who had been quiet until now, asked, Were you surprised by his death? Andrew paused, the sherry glass just touching his lips. A little, he said at last, but not shocked. Philip was always tightly wound. If you'd asked me what would get him, I'd have said either a heart attack or some foolish accident involving a broken ladder and a moth-eaten journal. Poirot smiled faintly. A colorful picture, monsieur. But forgive me, I must ask you, did Philip ever speak to you of a clock? A clock? Andrew looked puzzled. No, not to me. Why? Curious, that is all, Poirot replied. The clocks in this house seem mischievous. Andrew gave a short laugh. Everything in this house is at least a little mad. You'll see. Later that afternoon, Poirot asked Lady Margaret if he might review Philip's personal belongings. She led him to the late man's bedroom, a space both immaculate and strangely impersonal. A few books, mostly on British legal history, were neatly stacked on a writing desk. No photographs, no personal mementos, save one, an ivory-handled magnifying glass resting atop a leather-bound ledger with frayed corners. Philip was methodical, Lady Margaret said softly. He had an instinct for detail, though he rarely spoke of what he found. I suppose he preferred facts to feelings. Poirot flipped through the ledger, noting a series of neatly written entries marked with letters, A through F, each paired with a name, date, and a strange column labeled Adjustment. Some of the names were crossed out. Hastings frowned. Any idea what it means? Poirot did not answer at once. His fingers trailed along the margin, stopping at an entry that read E, 3rd March, 2 min slow, reset successful, beneath it, in smaller print. F, 4th March, tried to resist, saw me, burned, the photo, too late. Poirot closed the book gently. Curious, he murmured. Very curious indeed. Before dinner, they walked the long corridor leading from the library to the conservatory. Poirot paused outside the library, his gaze settling on the grandfather clock that stood sentry near the door. It ticked with solemn patience, but its hands too betrayed a flaw. This one was almost 2 minutes behind. Clocks do not forget, Hastings, Poirot said softly, and they do not lie unless someone teaches them to. At dinner, the family assembled. In addition to Lady Margaret and Andrew, there was Helena Blake, a coolly elegant woman with ash-blonde hair and high cheekbones, introduced as Philip's solicitor, and more distantly, a cousin. Across from her sat Reverend Timpson, the village vicar, and Miss Esme Dartmoor, a retired opera singer who had been a close friend of Lady Margaret's late husband. The meal passed with subdued conversation. Poirot observed closely the silences, the glances, the way Helena avoided Andrew's eyes, the way Esme's hand trembled when Lady Margaret mentioned Philip last evening. Afterward, as coffee was served, Poirot spoke to the group. "Tell me," he asked gently, "where was everyone on the evening of Philip's death, between 6:30 and 8 o'clock? A ripple of unease passed through the room. Andrew shrugged. "I was still in London." Helena spoke evenly. "I was working in my study, reviewing documents for a property sale. No one saw me." Reverend Timpson looked surprised. "I was at the rectory. I'd just come back from visiting the Creightons. Mrs. Creyton is very ill." "And you, mademoiselle?" Poirot turned to Esme. "I was here," she whispered, "in the music room, playing Chopin. No one came in." Lady Margaret looked up slowly. "I was in the green drawing room, reading." Then, after a pause, "Philip was in the study alone." "Ah," Poirot said, rising. "So we have all been alone. That makes for a difficult puzzle, n'est-ce pas? As the room returned to uneasy silence, Poirot crossed to the mantel and set the old clock forward precisely 1 minute and 13 seconds. One must always begin by correcting what is wrong, he said simply, even if the hands resist. Chapter 3. Secrets of the Study. The next morning found Greystoke Lodge veiled in mist. The windows of the study glistened with dew, and the quiet that blanketed the estate seemed heavier than usual. Poirot rose early, impeccably dressed in dove grey, and asked Lady Margaret for permission to revisit the study alone. The room remained untouched since Philip's death, and Poirot moved through it with careful reverence. He examined the chair where the body had been found. The seat cushion bore a faint indent still. The decanter was now covered, the crystal glasses washed and returned to their tray, but the air was still heavy with something unspoken. He opened a leather-bound journal on the desk. Its pages contained itemized entries, expenditures, legal contracts, handwritten summaries of various parcels of land. One page was torn out cleanly, leaving only a single ragged corner behind. Poirot leaned closer, frowning. The wastepaper basket beside the desk was empty, too empty, as if it had been recently cleared. He walked to the fireplace. The grate had been swept, but Poirot noted faint streaks of soot around the edges. He knelt, brushing his gloved fingers along the hearth. A scrap of blackened paper clung to the back brick. He retrieved it with tweezers from his pocket and studied it. The paper had burned unevenly. On one corner, a fragment of printed text remained. Right of revocation to pass. He folded it into his notebook with care. A legal phrase, mon ami, he muttered aloud. One does not burn such words lightly. Downstairs, breakfast was a quiet affair. Lady Margaret had retreated to her room with a headache, and Helena Blake was absent. Reverend Timpson had returned to the rectory, and only Hastings, Miss Dartmoor, and Andrew sat in the dining room. Poirot joined them, politely declining the kippas. Miss Dartmoor, he said conversationally, you have known this house long, no? Since before the war, she replied, buttering her toast. I knew Lady Margaret's husband well. He had excellent taste in wine and a dreadful temper. Philip was always different, quiet, suspicious, not unkind, just always looking over his shoulder. And yet he remained here. Oh yes, wouldn't leave the house, not even for holidays. He had a peculiar obsession with family history. Spent hours in the archive room, poring over wills and inventories. Poirot nodded. And what of the clocks, mademoiselle? Did Philip ever speak of them? Miss Dartmoor raised an eyebrow. He kept them tuned like a maestro. Once said something odd to me about the truth in the ticking. I thought it was a metaphor, or a joke. Poirot gave a thin smile. He was, perhaps, more precise than poetic. Andrew laughed softly, or more paranoid than precise. Poirot rose, excusing himself. He found Helena Blake returning through the front door, dressed in a charcoal suit, her expression tight. Mademoiselle, Poirot said gently, you were not at breakfast. I had business in town, she said. Philip's passing has left several estate matters to handle, but not, I imagine, any that would require such early attention. Helena regarded him coolly. Is this an interrogation, Monsieur Poirot? "Only a conversation," he said lightly. "Tell me, do you know of a legal document, one involving revocation of rights, that Philip might have found recently?" She hesitated. "No, but Philip was always chasing shadows, family scandals, lost amendments. I told him more than once to focus on the present. He didn't listen." "Did he ever show you a photograph he intended to destroy?" Helena blinked. "A photograph? No." Poirot's expression did not change. "Then someone else in this house may have seen what he did not wish them to see." He left her at the stairs and rejoined Hastings in the library. "Something is beginning to take shape, Hastings," he murmured. "But we must be delicate. We are pulling at a thread woven into a family tapestry. One knot may unravel it all." They resumed their examination of the ground floor. Poirot took particular interest in a narrow servants' corridor that linked the kitchen to the study. It was a short passage, dark and seldom used, with an old dumbwaiter at the far end. Poirot tested the floorboards. One creaked distinctly. He nodded to himself. "Now tell me, Hastings," he said, stepping back into the light, "what do you make of a man who dies alone, surrounded by clocks he knew were wrong?" Hastings rubbed his chin. "I'd say a man with a keen sense of time." Poirot raised a finger. "Or a man afraid of it." That afternoon, Poirot asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Tremble, if she might show him the archive room. A narrow stone stair led to the east wing, where the family kept generations' worth of documents. It was dark and smelled of aged paper. Poirot examined the shelves, each labeled in faded ink. Windermere, Land Records, Windermere Legal, Windermere Private, Correspondence. Near the back, a drawer had been left slightly ajar. Inside was an envelope labeled Codicil, 1894, disputed. It was empty. Poirot stood still for a moment, then turned toward the small writing table nearby. He opened its drawer. There, tucked beneath a map of the estate, was a silver cigarette case. He opened it. Empty, except for a matchstick and a folded scrap of paper. The note was hastily scribbled. "If Helena finds this, destroy it." "She cannot." "No." Poirot folded the paper carefully and placed it in his pocket. As he climbed the stairs, he murmured, "It is not only the clocks that are lying, Hastings. It is the people. And the question is, who lies to protect, and who lies to kill?" Chapter 4. A Whisper in the Archive. Poirot spent much of the afternoon seated on a bench in the Greystoke Lodge rose garden, a folded map of the estate on his lap and the note from Philip clutched between his fingers. The paper was thin, hastily torn, with 2 telltale creases. The sort of thing a man hides in desperation. And desperation, Poirot knew, was often louder than a scream. Captain Hastings appeared beside him with 2 steaming cups of tea. "You've hardly said a word all day," he remarked, handing one over. "Surely we're closer to something." Poirot accepted the cup, but kept his gaze on the gravel path. "Yes, mon ami, but it is like threading a needle in fog. I see shapes, outlines, but not yet the form." He opened the estate map again, pointing to a shaded portion in the southeast corner of the property. "Here, look closely. What do you see?" "A copse of yew trees." "No, no. Look again. The dashed line. An outline of a structure, square, unlabeled, not the gardener's shed. It is too far from the tool shed and the greenhouse. Hastings furrowed his brow. What was it then? I intend to find out. They made their way there after tea, through a thicket of dry shrubs and gnarled roots. It took some effort, but eventually they arrived at the spot. There it was, a moss-covered foundation of stone overgrown by ivy and nearly consumed by time, the remnants of what must once have been a small outbuilding or cabin. Poirot stepped lightly over a collapsed timber beam. Inside, the air was thick with damp and decay. But beneath a pile of rotted canvas, he found something odd. A rusted lockbox, sealed and bound with fraying twine. With gloved hands, Poirot cut the twine and opened the lid. Inside was a sheaf of yellowed papers, a photograph album with torn pages, and a pocket watch, its glass cracked, the minute hand missing entirely. He held it up to the light. "It is not a clock that is missing a minute," he said softly. "It is a man." "Pardon." Hastings blinked. Poirot turned one of the pages from the album. The photograph had been removed, the edges torn, but an outline remained. The shape of three people standing together. Below, the faded caption read, "Greystoke, 1913, M.A., and the boy." Hastings leaned closer. M for Margaret, A for Andrew, but who's the boy? Poirot closed the album carefully. That is what we must now learn. Back at the house, Lady Margaret was resting, and Helena was again nowhere to be seen. Poirot sought out Miss Dartmoor, who was seated near the conservatory, knitting a crimson scarf with long, deliberate strokes. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "I must ask you something delicate. Do you know of a child, perhaps illegitimate, connected to this family?" Miss Dartmoor's needles paused mid-click. Her gaze did not lift. "There were whispers," she said after a moment. "Years ago, before the war, Margaret's husband Henry, he was not always faithful. There was a housemaid. She vanished one spring, and soon after that, the east wing was closed for renovations." Poirot nodded slowly. "And the child," she gave a thin, brittle smile. "No one ever spoke of him. Not directly. But I remember one day, Philip was barely 10. He found something in the attic. A baby's rattle. He was upset. Said something to his father. The next week the attic was locked and the key destroyed." Poirot folded his hands behind his back. The sins of the past, Miss Dartmoor, cast long shadows. "Indeed," she said, looking out toward the trees, "especially in houses with too many clocks and too few truths." As evening fell, Poirot stood once again in the study. He studied the mantel clock, its minute hand now slightly bent, and then turned his attention to the fireplace. With Hastings' help, he carefully removed the iron grate and peered inside. Lodged behind a soot-stained brick was another, torn piece of paper. This one read, "Codicil filed 1914. Illegitimate heir recognized for eyes only." Poirot stood still. "The motive," he whispered. "It is not money, not entirely. It is a shame and fear. Someone buried this for decades. But Philip found it." That night, Poirot dined alone with Lady Margaret. She wore a dark silk gown and pearls, her expression calm, but her hands fidgeted with the napkin. "I must ask you directly, madam," Poirot said quietly over the soup. Was there ever another child outside your marriage? Her spoon paused mid-air. No, she said. Then softly, but there was another claim. Poirot waited. My husband was careless, she said after a long pause. There was a girl, Rosalind. She worked here as a parlour maid. I dismissed her quietly, sent her to a cousin in Cornwall. We received a letter a year later. A boy had been born. She claimed he was Henry's. And did your husband accept this? Never allowed, she said bitterly. But he made arrangements, money, letters, and then he drew up that cursed codicil. I forbade him from filing it. He swore he destroyed it. But perhaps, yes, Poirot said, perhaps he only hid it. She met his eyes. And now you think Philip found it? I know he did, Poirot replied, and someone else knew he had. The question now is, who had the most to lose if the truth came out? Lady Margaret's gaze turned cold. You think one of us murdered him? I think, Poirot said softly, that one of you feared losing your place in the great clockwork of Greystoke Lodge. And that fear stopped time for Philip Windermere. Chapter 5. The Man Without a Past. The following morning broke with a sharp wind rustling the dry hedges along the southern lawn. Poirot, as ever, rose early, and by the time Hastings joined him at breakfast, the little Belgian was already poring over a handwritten inventory he had requested from Lady Margaret's solicitor the night before. Hastings looked over the list, curiously. More legal documents. Poirot tapped his finger against a line near the bottom. Note here, mon ami, a trust fund established in 1914. Not for Philip, not for Andrew, not even for Lady Margaret, simply labeled C.W. Hastings frowned. Initials. Indeed, but not any we have yet encountered. And the trust is irregular. Funds were dispersed sporadically until 1932. Then nothing. Could be a servant, perhaps. Poirot gave a small shake of his head. No, this trust was established with discretion. Too much discretion. There is purpose in its vagueness. As they sipped coffee in the drawing-room, the housekeeper, Mrs. Tremble, entered with a folded note. This was left in the library last night, she said. No signature, just the name. Yours. Poirot opened the note. It was written in an uneven, almost shaky hand. He knew about the boy. He knew about the watch. That's why he died. Don't trust the quiet ones. The clock isn't broken, it's hiding. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He refolded the note slowly. Who delivered this? He asked. Mrs. Tremble shook her head. It was left under the decanter. I found it this morning when dusting. He thanked her and sent for Andrew Windermere. The younger man arrived moments later, looking freshly shaved, crisply dressed, but unmistakably tired. You've been restless, monsieur, Poirot said gently. I heard someone pacing above the green drawing-room in the early hours. Andrew gave a short laugh. I couldn't sleep. Old houses and older memories, I suppose. Do you recognize the initials C.W.? Andrew blinked. Can't say I do. Why? Poirot handed him the trust summary. Curious, Andrew muttered. Set up the same year as the supposed codicil. You think they're related? I do not think, monsieur. I suspect. Thinking comes later, when the facts are aligned. Andrew glanced out the window. Philip always did believe there was someone else, a rightful heir. He was obsessed with proving it. I told him it would tear the family apart, but he never listened. You spoke before of a quarrel over the inheritance. What was its nature? Andrew hesitated. Philip accused me, without proof, of knowing more than I claimed. He said I had access to the grandfather's original will, that I'd tampered with it before it was passed to the family solicitor. I swore I hadn't, but he never truly believed me. And had you? Andrew's face toned hard. No, I may not have liked Philip, but I didn't kill him. Poirot gave a slight nod. That, Monsieur Windmere, remains to be proven or disproven. Later that morning, Poirot sought out Helena Blake. She stood alone in the solarium, a cigarette burning between her fingers despite the hour. Her posture was controlled, elegant, but her face bore the strain of something unresolved. I must ask you again, mademoiselle, Poirot said. Did Philip ever confide in you about the codicil or the boy? Helena exhaled smoke slowly. We were close once, years ago. But no, he never mentioned it, and I doubt he would have. He didn't trust easily. Poirot stepped closer. Yet you were here the night he died, and your alibi, that you were reviewing documents, no one can confirm. Her expression flickered. That's true, but it doesn't make me guilty. Poirot looked at her cigarette, then at her hand. You tremble, mademoiselle. I'm cold, she snapped. No, you are frightened. She threw the cigarette into the fireplace with a sharp flick. Philip had discovered something. He wouldn't tell me what, but he said it would change everything. That was 3 days before he died. What did he ask of you? Her voice dropped. He asked me to help him find a safe place to hide a document. Said he didn't trust the lawyers, not even Lady Margaret. He was going to rewrite his own will, one who named someone else, someone forgotten. Poirot leaned forward. Did he say who? No, she whispered. Only that he wasn't the real heir. That someone else, someone named Charles, was meant to inherit Greystoke. Poirot stepped back, his eyes sharp. Charles Windmere. Helena stared. How did you know that name? I don't, Poirot said. Not entirely, but the pieces begin to align. He left her with her silence and returned to the study, where Hastings waited. I believe, Poirot said, we are very close to unmasking a phantom, one who has lived beneath the surface of this household for nearly 4 decades. Hastings raised an eyebrow. But what of the clocks? Why are they important? Poirot walked to the mantelpiece. Because they mark not only the hour of death, but the hour of truth. Philip reset every clock in this house. Everyone but one. He turned to the fireplace and reached beneath the grate, where the stone had been loosened days earlier. He withdrew a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, a second watch, tarnished, cracked, but with the initials CW etched faintly on the reverse. Poirot placed it gently on the table. Philip knew who the boy was. He found the codicil. He found the truth. But someone else found him first. The lodge seemed to sigh under the weight of its secrets. And far above, in the bell tower of the old chapel, a clock struck the hour. But once again, it was late by 1 minute. Chapter 6. The Face in the Photograph. That evening, Poirot sat alone, in the drawing room, the fire casting long shadows across the parquet floor. Before him lay an array of objects. The cracked pocket watch etched with the initials CW, the scorched corner of legal parchment, the oilcloth wrapping, and the faded estate map. Nearby, the torn photograph album remained open to the ghostly outline of 3 figures, M, A, and the boy. Poirot's eyes were fixed on that outline. It was not merely the absence of the photograph that intrigued him, but the way the paper beneath had faded unevenly. A long exposure, perhaps. That photo had remained in place for decades, untouched until, quite recently, it was removed. By whom? A soft knock at the door roused him. It was Hastings, coat still damp from his walk through the village. "I've just come back from the Herp vicarage," he said, shaking off the chill. Reverend Timpson wasn't there, but his wife was. She remembered something strange from years ago. Poirot gestured for him to continue. She said that back in the 1930s, there was talk in the parish of a boy who was sent to live with a distant cousin in Yorkshire. No surname was ever given, just that the child had been gifted a legacy from a family too proud to name him. She remembers it vividly because the child's guardian came to the rectory to ask for a letter of recommendation for the boy's school application. And get this, his first name was Charles. Poirot closed his eyes. May we? So the ghost has a name and a traceable past. And more, Hastings added, pulling a yellowed envelope from his pocket. Mrs. Timpson found this in their archives. It's a letter from Henry Windermere, Lady Margaret's late husband, addressed to the vicar at the time. It refers to a Charles and says, and I quote, "The boy's mother has passed. I cannot raise him openly. Make arrangements. The trust will cover the expenses discreetly." Poirot took the letter gently and scanned it, his brows slowly rising. There it is, the proof. Lady Margaret may have forbidden the filing of the codicil, but her husband took measures nonetheless. Charles was his son. "But where is Charles now?" Hastings asked. Poirot looked toward the fire. "That, my friend, is the final shadow. I believe he has already returned." Hastings stared. "You mean someone here?" Poirot nodded slowly. I believe Charles Windermere has walked these halls recently, perhaps even under a name not his own. Philip knew. That is why he began resetting the clocks. Not as an eccentric act, but as a message, to mark time passing improperly. Each adjusted minute was a signal, a breadcrumb. Just then, Miss Esme Dartmoor entered, her face pale. "Monsieur Poirot, you should come. There's been a disturbance." He and Hastings followed her swiftly to the library, where Lady Margaret stood near the hearth, trembling slightly. On the floor was the photograph, the very one missing from the album. It had been returned, torn precisely in half. The part showing Lady Margaret and Andrew remained. The third figure, the boy, had been removed. Where was this found? Poirot asked sharply. By the hearth, Lady Margaret said, her voice tight. Someone slipped it under the grate. Mrs. Tremble found it while tending the fire. Poirot picked it up with a handkerchief. This is no accident. This is a message. Someone is trying to erase Charles. Hastings frowned. Or trying to hide the fact that he is already among us. Poirot turned to Lady Margaret. "Madame, I must insist. Do you know where Charles was sent?" She hesitated. "I never asked. Henry told me it had been taken care of. I wanted the child forgotten." Poirot's voice softened. "And yet he has returned. He asked for Helena, but she was not in her room, nor was she in the solarium, study, or garden. It was nearly an hour before Mrs. Tremble found her sitting alone in the east wing, in the long-disused nursery. Poirot entered quietly. Helena looked up. Her eyes were rimmed red, a photograph clutched tightly in her lap. "You knew, didn't you?" Poirot said, gently. She gave a hollow laugh. "I wasn't sure, not until I saw this. Philip left it in my drawer before he died. He knew I would come here eventually." She handed him the photograph. It was of a boy, no more than 7, standing in front of the Greystoke fountain. The same boy from the missing photo. On the back was scrawled, "Charles Windermere, 1921." Poirot studied her carefully. "Why did you not say anything sooner?" "Because I thought it might be me," she whispered, "that I might have helped cause his death. I didn't tell anyone about the will. I was afraid. But now I know it wasn't me." Poirot placed a hand on her shoulder. "No, mademoiselle, but your silence played its part." That night, Poirot returned to his room and opened his notebook. One by one, he listed each suspect. Lady Margaret stood to lose her legacy, her reputation, and the estate's dignity. Andrew Windermere, disinherited, bitter, and present just before Philip's death. Helena Blake, aware of the document and its implications. Miss Dartmoor, the old witness, but perhaps the only innocent. Charles Windermere, unknown, unseen, or perhaps already here. At the top of the page, he wrote, "The clocks lied to everyone, except for Philip. He told their truth in time, and someone silenced him to keep the hour from striking." As midnight passed, the grandfather clock in the hall struck 12. Or rather, it struck 11. Poirot smiled to himself. "The final clue, mon ami. Now we begin to see clearly." Chapter 7. The Man Who Wasn't Named. The following morning, a heavy fog rolled across the lawns of Greystoke Lodge, swallowing the hedges and statues in a damp, spectral haze. The estate seemed suspended in time, its great clock faces all running with a deliberate slowness, as though the house itself feared what would happen when the hour struck true. Poirot stood by the window of the study, watching the mist curl against the glass. He had not slept. Instead, he had spent the early hours revisiting every corner of the house where a clock had been touched. The minute discrepancies, the precise delays, they weren't random. They formed a pattern, a message. Hastings arrived, bearing the Morning Post and a cup of strong tea. "Another grey day," he muttered, setting the tray down. "And no word from the village constable yet. I asked him to look into boarding school records in Yorkshire. If a Charles Windermere passed through, there must be a trace." Poirot gave a faint smile. "The past always leaves fingerprints, mon ami, even if the culprit wears gloves." Just then, a soft knock interrupted them. It was Reverend Timpson. His face was unusually pale, and he clutched his hat tightly in both hands. "Forgive the intrusion, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice low. "But I thought you should see this." He produced an envelope, thick parchment tied with a bread string. On its front, in ink barely legible with age, were the words, "Codicil to the last will and testament of Henry Ambrose Windermere, 1914. Poirot took it with care, Where did you find this?" "In the parish safe," Timpson replied. "I had forgotten it entirely. It was buried beneath baptism records from the war years. I was cataloging archives this morning, and there it was." Poirot opened it carefully. The document inside was short, direct. It named one Charles Windermere, son of Rosalind Clark, as the rightful heir to Henry Windermere's personal estate, in equal consideration with Philip Ambrose Windermere, should both be living upon the reading of my final will. A marginal note, scrawled in a firmer hand, perhaps the vicar's predecessor, read, "Filed but never executed. Remanded to private safekeeping at Lady M's request. Not destroyed." Poirot read it twice, then folded it neatly. "This, monsieur, is the storm's eye." When Reverend Timpson had gone, Hastings turned to him. "So the codicil is real. Charles was meant to inherit half. And now Philip discovered this, and someone silenced him before he could make it public." "Oui," Poirot said. "And the murderer believed this document to be destroyed. And Defoe, return throws everything into chaos." He paused, then added, "But the murderer made a mistake. A small one. A matter of time." They walked the house again, Poirot asking the same questions, but now with sharper intent. In the conservatory, he confronted Andrew Windermere. "You said you returned the night before the funeral, but the station master says you arrived in Harrowby Green 3 days earlier." Andrew's jaw tightened. "I stayed at the Swan Inn. I didn't want to be at the lodge. I wasn't sure I was welcome." "You lied, monsieur," Andrew flared. "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're suggesting. Yes, I arrived early. I wanted to speak to Philip privately, to ask if we could settle things quietly, before lawyers got involved. But I never saw him. He refused to meet." "And yet," Poirot said calmly, "someone found him in the study, alone, shortly after supper, and someone ensured the minute hand on the mantel clock would forever point not to the hour of his death, but to a missing moment." Andrew said nothing. Poirot moved on. In the East Wing, he found Helena Blake again. She stood at the long-abandoned nursery window, staring down into the mist-covered rose garden. "Charles Windermere was your client, wasn't he?" Poirot asked softly. She turned sharply. "What?" "You've been working in London, handling estates, transferring minor assets. The name Charles appears nowhere in the Windermere legal files, but you've been requesting records from the Office of Public Births under that name for weeks." She closed her eyes. "Yes, Philip asked me to trace him, quietly. He suspected Charles had been adopted under another name. We found a match in Yorkshire, a Charles Emery. He's living in France now. A painter, no idea of his lineage. You informed Philip." "I did. He was preparing to bring Charles here, to change the will. That's why he needed protection." Poirot's voice grew colder. "And you were the only one who knew both the identity of Charles and the location of the codicil." "I didn't kill him," she said sharply. I thought he would be safe. That's why I helped him hide the codicil. But someone else was watching. Someone who wanted the past buried for good." Poirot nodded. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You may have risked much more than you know." That evening, Poirot asked Lady Eowulfius Shokes, Margaret, to summon everyone to the drawing-room after dinner. The sun dipped below the hills, and the grandfather clock in the main hallway began its chime again. 1 minute late. Poirot stood before the hearth, every detail of his appearance immaculate. Dark green suit, white pocket square, silver cane glinting at his side. He turned to face the assembled group. Lady Margaret, Andrew, Helena, Reverend Timpson, Miss Dartmoor, Hastings at his side. "My friends," he began, "we have reached the edge of the curtain. One more tug, and the final scene shall be revealed." No one spoke. Poirot continued. Philip Windermere discovered the truth. He learned that the family had buried a child, Charles Windermere, born out of wedlock, hidden for the sake of propriety. His father left instructions to amend the will, but fear, shame, and pride prevented it from becoming law. The clocks, the torn photograph, the scorched paper, all were fragments of Philip's attempt to resurrect that truth. Poirot paused, letting his words settle. But someone feared what that truth would mean, not just for inheritance, but for identity. Someone who knew that if the world learned Charles was the rightful heir, everything would crumble. And so, Poirot concluded, his voice hardening, they took 1 minute from time, just enough to kill, just enough to slip out unseen, and just enough to silence a man forever. The room was still. Poirot stepped back from the fire. "And now I shall tell you who did it." The clock on the wall ticked. A long, deliberate pause. And then Poirot smiled gently, his eyes flashing. "But first, let us hear from the man who was never meant to be found." And from the doorway behind them, a soft voice said, "I'm here." Chapter 8. The air in the hallway, all heads turned at once. Standing in the doorway, half illuminated by the flickering wall sconce, was a man of about 40, dressed plainly in a dark overcoat and corduroy trousers. He carried no bag, no hat. His hair was tousled from the wind outside, and his eyes, gray, uncertain but steady, swept across the assembled room with quiet recognition. Poirot stepped forward. "You are Charles Windermere." The man nodded. "Yes, though I've not used that name in years." Helena rose from her seat slowly. "Charles, you came." Charles's eyes softened at the sight of her. "Your letter reached me. I arrived late last night, but I wasn't ready. I walked the estate this morning. I stood by the old yew tree. I remembered nothing." Lady Margaret's hand trembled on the armrest. How dare you come here without—" Poirot lifted a hand gently. "Madame, I must ask you to let him speak." Charles stepped farther into the room, his voice low but firm. "I didn't come to take anything. I came because Philip wanted me to. He sent word. He said he had found the truth about who I was, where I came from, about my mother." Miss Dartmoor spoke softly. "Rosalind Clark." Charles nodded. "I grew up believing she had died giving birth. I was raised by a couple in York, friends of a church benefactor. They were kind, but distant. They told me I was lucky to be taken in, that I was not to ask questions. When I turned 21, I received a trust payment and a letter with 2 lines. 'Your name is Charles Windermere. Never return to Greystoke Lodge.'" Poirot took a step forward. "Who sent the letter?" "I don't know," Charles said. "It was unsigned." Andrew stood now, glaring. "This is madness. There's no proof this man is who he says." Poirot turned to him. But there is. We have the photograph, the trust records, the original codicil recovered from the rectory, and, most damning of all, Philip's ledger. It contains notes, dates, even correspondence traced back to Charles's adoptive family. He paced slowly before the hearth. Philip's discovery was thorough. He had cross-referenced family assets, dates of disbursements, and the peculiar timing of the clocks. He deduced that someone still living, had attempted to erase Charles's existence. Poirot's gaze turned sharp, but the truth, mes amis, is not so easily buried. Lady Margaret's face had grown ashen. Her lips parted, but no words came. Charles's voice trembled. Did you know? Did you tell my mother to leave? She turned toward him slowly. I told her she was not welcome. I told her she would not ruin everything my husband built. Poirot nodded sadly. You see, Hastings, not hatred, not greed, but pride, the most terrible of motives. The silence that followed was heavy. Poirot turned now to face the group more directly. But the murder, that was not Lady Margaret's doing. No, hers was a sin of omission. The crime, I fear, belonged to someone else. He looked to Andrew Windermere. You came to Greystoke days before Philip's death. You lied about your arrival. You met with Philip in secret. And when he refused to suppress what he had found, you struck. Andrew stepped back, color draining from his face. That's not true. You altered the clocks, Poirot continued, each by the same delay, 1 minute and 13 seconds. Enough to confuse the coroner's estimated time of death, enough to cast suspicion on others. But the library clock, you left it untouched. Why? Andrew hesitated. I didn't, because, Poirot said, you forgot it was wound differently, that it could not be reset the same way as the rest. Philip had already locked that inconsistency in his notes. It was your mistake. Andrew's fists clenched. You think I killed him over money. I didn't want the estate. I didn't want anything. You wanted to be seen. Poirot said, all your life you lived in Philip's shadow, denied your father's affection, denied the trust your cousin received. And when you learned he planned to give it all to a man you had never met, one who had never suffered the same burdens. Poirot stepped close, his voice dropping to a whisper. You broke. Andrew lunged forward suddenly, but Hastings intercepted him, grabbing his arm with a force that surprised even himself. Don't, Hastings said. It's over. Poirot turned to Charles, who had stood quietly throughout. You may claim your name now, monsieur, but the decision whether to pursue the inheritances is yours alone. Charles looked down, then back at Lady Margaret, whose face was still frozen in that fragile, wounded dignity. I didn't come for the estate, he said. I came for the truth, and I have it now. Poirot inclined his head. Then justice has been served. A silence settled over the room. The clocks ticked softly once more, synchronized now, for the first time in weeks. Outside, the fog had lifted, and the minute that had been missing was finally found. Chapter 9. The hour that struck twice. The next day dawned cold and quiet, as if Greystoke Lodge itself were recovering from a long illness. The clocks throughout the house had been adjusted. The ticking was no longer sinister, no longer out of step. The missing minute had been restored, and with it, a certain order had returned. not just to the passage of time, but to the soul of the place. Yet Poirot, immaculate as ever, did not seem at ease. He sat in the morning room, a thin shaft of pale sunlight tracing his shoulder. Before him lay the codicil, the photograph, and Philip's final ledger, open to the last entry, one that had not yet been fully deciphered. Hastings entered quietly, carrying a fresh pot of tea. "I must say, Poirot, you handled the whole business rather spectacularly. Andrew will likely face trial, and Charles, well, I suppose he'll disappear back to France." Poirot did not reply immediately. His gaze was locked on the last scroll in Philip's hand. The timekeeper never forgets, but beware, the clock that strikes twice. Hastings poured the tea, puzzled. "What do you suppose that means?" Poirot tapped his chin. "It troubled me, Hastings, all night. I slept little. The case, it appears resolved, and yet something remains not in order." "You mean Andrew?" "No. His guilt is certain. But the method, his movements, the altered clocks, the way he entered the study, all plausible, but too clean, too mechanical." He turned the page in the ledger. "There is another layer, one Philip suspected, one he never had the chance to reveal." Poirot rose and gestured for Hastings to follow him. They returned to the study. The air there was warmer now, the shadows softened by morning light. Poirot moved directly to the mantel clock. He lifted it gently and placed it on the desk. "Tell me, Hastings, when does a clock strike twice?" Hastings frowned. "When it malfunctions, I suppose. Or," Poirot said softly, "when it is made two." With a deft motion, he opened the back panel. Inside was a strange contraption, brass gears fitted with a small handmade spring assembly. Not original. Carefully added. Poirot reached in and removed a slip of folded paper, hidden beneath the bell mechanism. On it, in Philip's hand, "If I do not live to say it, Helena found Charles, but someone else found her first. She does not know. I fear she may be watched or used. Tell her only when you are sure." Hastings's eyes widened. "You mean someone else manipulated her?" Poirot nodded gravely. "Indeed, Helena believed she was protecting Philip, but in truth, she was being observed, and someone clever, used her knowledge to act first." He turned now to the hearth and withdrew from his coat pocket the matchstick he had discovered days earlier. "Do you recall this from the silver cigarette case?" "Yes. It seemed a strange thing to keep." "It is not strange when one considers who in this house smokes exclusively in the East Wing, and who knew the corridors well enough to move unnoticed." "Helena?" Hastings asked, startled. "No," Poirot said quietly. "Lady Margaret." They returned to the drawing room, where Lady Margaret sat reading, her spectacles perched low on her nose. She looked up as they entered. "Monsieur Poirot." Poirot bowed. "Madame, I must ask you one final question." She nodded slowly. "When did you last wind the library clock?" Her expression faltered. I haven't in years." "Precisely," Poirot said, "and yet it kept perfect time, until 2 weeks ago, when it began to fall behind, just as the others did. Someone altered it, but unlike the others, this one was adjusted twice." He stepped closer. Philip's message was clear. "The clock that strikes Twice refers not only to the mechanism, but to the second hand that acts. The second accomplice. Lady Margaret's hands trembled. Philip learned the truth about Charles and accepted it. Poirot continued. But he did not expect to be silenced, and when the codicil resurfaced, you feared it would destroy everything. She closed the book in her lap. I never meant for Philip to die, she whispered. I only wanted to delay him, to delay the shame. I thought if I changed the clocks, if I made it seem irregular, the lawyers would hesitate. I did not know Andrew would act so violently. You rewound the study clock? Poirot asked. She nodded. He told me, afterward. He was distraught. But I couldn't allow the truth to come out. Not then. And now? Lady Margaret rose slowly. Now, it is no longer mine to suppress. Poirot gave a slight bow. Then justice has not only been served but accepted. As they departed the room, Hastings shook his head in disbelief. 2 hands on the same crime, and both pointing to the hour. Poirot smiled faintly. Just so, Hastings. The hour always strikes, whether we listen or not. The clocks in Greystoke Lodge chimed as one. For the first time in years, they struck on time, and this time only once. Chapter 10. The Final Minute. The storm that had loomed so long over Greystoke Lodge finally broke that evening, though not in thunder or rain. It came in the form of silence, an uneasy quiet that settled upon the estate like a verdict handed down from time itself. There were no more accusations, no more secrets waiting to be found in clocks or fire grates, only the aftermath. Poirot stood once again in the rose garden, his gloved hands behind his back, watching the wind ripple through the hedges. Autumn had crept in quietly, bringing a golden dullness to the leaves. Behind him, Hastings approached, with news. Andrew's confession has been taken. He's in the custody of the local constable. He said very little, but enough. Poirot nodded, not turning around. And Lady Margaret, he asked softly. She's retired to her room. Reverend Timpson is with her. There was a pause. Poirot inhaled deeply. She will carry her guilt the rest of her life. But it was not guilt for the crime, it was for the lie. She loved her family more than the truth. That, Hastings, is the more dangerous devotion. I suppose Charles will stay. Poirot finally turned. No, he will go. That much was evident in his eyes. The estate, the title, the land, these are relics of a past that did not raise him. He came for truth, not legacy. They found Charles in the archive room, where the air still smelled faintly of paper and time. He was standing at the window, a suitcase at his feet, the old pocket watch with CW initials in his hand. Poirot entered quietly. You are leaving, monsieur. Charles nodded. There's nothing for me here. I was never part of this world, not really. You are now. You carry its name. Charles offered a wan smile. And what has that name given me? A grave, torn photograph, a trust fund sent in silence. And yet, Philip tried. He tried to reach me. That counts for something. Poirot stepped forward. He did more than try. He risked everything. And he left behind a clue in each misplaced minute. He trusted you would come. Charles turned the watch in his hand. Funny, isn't it? All this over time, over a single minute. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Time is never trivial, monsieur. It is the only thing we never reclaim once lost. Charles pocketed the watch. What happens now? You go, Poirot said gently. You live, you paint, you carry the story, but not the burden. Let that remain here, with the clocks and the dust. Charles gave him a final nod and left, the heavy wooden door of the archive room clicking shut behind him. Later that evening, Poirot sat in the green drawing room beside the fire, a slim black notebook in his hand. Hastings was across from him, dozing with a newspaper on his chest. Poirot wrote with precision, as always. Case: the clock that missed a minute victim. Philip Windermere motive: inheritance, legacy, shame. Culprits: Andrew Windermere, primary. Lady Margaret Windermere, accessory. Resolution: justice rendered through confession and consequence. Truth restored. He closed the notebook and tapped it once with his pen. And then, as though compelled by ritual, he rose and walked the house one last time. From study to solarium, library to hallway, Poirot checked each clock. They all read it, the same hour. None were fast, none were slow. When he came to the grandfather clock in the front hall, he placed a hand gently on its oak frame. Mon ami, he murmured, you have borne witness to so much. But now, rest. He turned and descended the front steps, where the night air was crisp and a taxi idled in the drive. Hastings joined him moments later. So, said Hastings, settling in beside him as the car pulled away, another case closed. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, but Hastings, it is never truly closed. A clock may be repaired, yes, but the time it once kept, that we cannot recover. And what do we learn from it? Poirot turned his gaze to the stars above. That truth, like time, always reveals itself, even when hidden behind dust, silence, or a missing minute. The car turned down the long gravel road, Greystoke Lodge fading into shadow behind them, and somewhere within, a single clock struck the hour, precisely, perfectly, and without delay. Chapter 11. The Quiet Echo. 2 weeks later, London was grey with drizzle. The streets glistened with wet reflections, and the steady beat of umbrellas formed a polite sort of symphony as they passed outside the windows of Whitehaven mansions. Poirot sat contentedly by the fire, a fine Persian rug beneath his feet and a delicate porcelain cup of chocolate steaming at his elbow. Everything was as it should be, en ordre. And yet Hastings, seated nearby with the Evening Chronicle folded under his arm, was watching Poirot with a subtle unease. You're still thinking about it, aren't you? Poirot didn't look up. About what, mon ami? You know what I mean. Greystoke Lodge. The clocks, Philip Windermere, Charles. Poirot smiled faintly. But of course, one does not walk away from a puzzle so finely wrought without revisiting the intricacies. He rose, crossed to his desk, and retrieved a small envelope. From within, he withdrew a note, the final one, discovered only after their departure. It had arrived by post at Whitehaven Mansions 3 days prior, unsigned, its return address left blank. Poirot unfolded it again, eyes narrowing slightly. You saw the face, but not the hand. Time was not the only thing stolen. You missed the one who watched from behind the curtain. Hastings frowned as Poirot handed it to him. You think it's a threat? No. A reminder. But from whom? That I do not yet know. Poirot walked to the window. Raindrops ticked lightly against the glass, like the minute hand of a clock. It was too clean, Hastings. Yes. Andrew confessed. Yes. Lady Margaret admitted her complicity. And yet, he toned, there are questions still unanswered, such as, why did Philip truly wait to act until now? He had uncovered Charles's identity months before. Why not reveal it then? Maybe he feared Lady Margaret's reaction. Poirot shook his head. No, Philip was not a man ruled by fear. He was methodical, careful. He delayed for a reason. He retrieved Philip's final notebook from his drawer. Hastings had assumed Poirot had returned it to the authorities. Poirot opened it to the back cover. Look here, he said. A series of names. Margaret, Andrew, Helena, Charles Dartmoor, and one more. Hastings leaned in. Timson. Poirot nodded slowly. The vicar. Hastings sat back. But surely Reverend Timson was above suspicion. No one is above suspicion, Hastings. Least of all, someone who safeguards the parish archives. Who could remove a codicil, or delay its delivery? Poirot moved to his bookcase, selecting a slim blue volume on English inheritance law. What if the codicil was found earlier? What if someone had discovered it before Philip and tried to suppress it? But who? Someone with access. Someone who benefited from the estate's quiet status quo. Someone who feared a legal challenge, not out of greed but out of complication. Perhaps not a murderer, but certainly a manipulator. Hastings blinked. You're saying Reverend Timson may have known more than he admitted. Poirot closed the book with a soft snap. I say only this. The hand that moves the clock is not always the one that winds it. The fire crackled behind them. Outside, the city clocks began to chime the hour. Poirot moved back to his chair, smoothing the front of his waistcoat. We may never know the full truth, Hastings. The law is satisfied. The guilty have confessed. But as for the whole story... He sipped his chocolate. Perhaps it lies in the silences between the chimes. There was a knock at the door. Poirot glanced at the time. Just on the dot. That will be Charles. Hastings's eyebrows lifted. He's coming here. Poirot nodded. He requested one final conversation. He said he had something to leave behind. Moments later, Charles Winmer entered, now clean-shaven, with a newer coat and a small leather satchel under his arm. He greeted them both warmly, yet with that same reserved composure. I wanted to thank you, Monsieur Poirot, he said, not for the name, not for the legacy, but for the truth, even if it came late. Poirot nodded solemnly. You deserve to know who you were. Charles opened the satchel and drew out the cracked pocket watch, the one with CW etched on the back. I don't want to keep it, he said. It doesn't belong in a studio in Montmartre. It belongs with the one who heard it ticking all along. Poirot accepted it gently. Merci, monsieur. Charles hesitated at the door. Do you believe we can escape the past? Poirot tilted his head. Escape it? No. But we can choose not to be its prisoner. Charles smiled faintly. Then he was gone. The apartment fell into silence again, save for the rhythmic ticking of the carriage clock on Poirot's mantel. Hastings leaned back. "So, is it over now?" Poirot gave one of his small, enigmatic smiles. "The case is over, Hastings, but time never ends." The minute hand clicked forward, and Poirot, ever watchful, was still listening. Chapter 12. The Hands of the Clock. 1 month later, the case of the clock that Mr. Minute passed quietly into the archives of Scotland Yard. The newspapers, which had at first stirred themselves with columns of speculation about the scandal at Greystoke Lodge, had long since shifted focus to a bank robbery in Kent and the appearance of a new film star in the West End. But in Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot continued to reflect upon the strange matter with the thoughtful intensity of a man who sees patterns where others see coincidence. He sat alone one crisp November evening, the fire casting a warm glow across the polished floor, his hands clasped before him, and a single object resting on the table beside his chair. The cracked pocket, watch marked CW. Its face was repaired, its ticking steady. Hastings returned from his club, hanging up his coat with a sigh of contentment. "You know," he said, settling into his seat, "I've thought it over a dozen times, and I still say it's remarkable how you saw what no one else could. The clocks, the minutes, the codicil, all of it. And yet, what stays with me most is Charles." Poirot smiled faintly. "He is the question mark that lingers. He's gone back to France, I imagine." "Yes. He wrote to me. He has taken a small flat in Arles. He paints again, a series called Minutes and Shadows." Poirot gave a small chuckle. Artists are never without irony. Hastings leaned forward. But if he truly wasn't after the estate, if he wasn't bitter or vengeful, then what did he come for? Poirot tapped the watch beside him. Closure. He came not to claim a fortune, but to recover a name. A man cannot live fully in the present if he does not know the truth of his past. Hastings nodded. "And Andrew, in custody. His solicitor has requested leniency on the grounds of emotional distress and historic grievances. I suspect he will face prison, but not for long. The court will see him not as a killer in cold blood, but as a man unraveled by secrecy, jealousy, and a final act of desperate preservation." "And Lady Margaret?" Poirot's gaze dimmed. "She has retired to the south coast. Her name will not be tarnished publicly. The Windermere family solicitor, with the approval of Charles, has allowed her to retain Greystoke Lodge as a life tenancy. Her punishment lies in memory, not legal indictment." Hastings was quiet for a moment, then asked, "And what of the vicar? You suspected?" "Ah," Poirot said softly, raising a finger. "I suspected he knew more than he let on. But it was not malice, it was a duty. The vicar had been instructed decades ago by Lady Margaret and by Henry Windermere to seal the truth. And like the clocks in the lodge, he obeyed until someone adjusted him otherwise." Poirot reached for the watch, turning it gently in his hand. You know why this case fascinated me, Hastings. Because of the clocks? No, because it was not about time, it was about identity. Who is remembered? Who is erased? Philip Windermere died not because of money, not because of revenge, but because he uncovered a truth others could not bear to face. That families do not exist only in parlor portraits and wills. They exist in mistakes, in illegitimate children, in lost letters and burned photographs. And when you try to cut one thread from the tapestry, you risk unraveling the whole. Hastings finished. Exactly. There was a pause. Poirot stood, buttoned his jacket, and moved to the mantel, where his clock, small, square, and perfectly precise, ticked in reliable rhythm. He adjusted it forward by 1 minute. Hastings looked up. "What are you doing?" Poirot smiled gently. "Restoring what was taken." Hastings tilted his head. "But it was already correct, wasn't it?" "Oui, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice soft and rich with meaning. "But sometimes a gesture must be made, not to mark time, but to honor it." The fire crackled softly behind them. The hands of the clock moved onward. And so did the world outside, unaware that, in one small flat above a quiet London street, a man with a waxed mustache and polished shoes had, once again, set things right.